Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to Free Association. I've got a piece to play today from a psychoanalysis of horror podcast. It's called a horror therapy podcast, where they're talking about the Blob, which is an old Steve McQueen science fiction kind of teenage. It's a drive-in movie basically. It's a teenage sci-fi movie with lots of people being chased and basically eaten by this alien blob thing that came from a meteorite. So the remake in 1988 is what they're talking about on this clip that I'm going to play. I don't know whether it's exactly where I want to start it, but I'll play it from here anyway and let it run through the analysis they do of the 80s, the themes in 80s horror movies, which I thought was interesting. So here we go. This is from Psychoanalysis, a Horror Therapy Podcast, and it's the episode on the Blob.
You can make a movie exactly like that anymore.
Yeah. I just recently saw Dream Warriors for the first time. And I think I grew up having some very definite biases against certain types of horror movies. And I was like, nah, I'm not going to like that. And I just didn't ever choose to watch it. And Freddy was one of them. And I was like, nah, he's too quippy for me. And I watched Dream Warriors and I was like, this is fantastic. Why have I robbed myself of all of these movies for so long? You know, I think I always really just wanted to be scared. And if I didn't think it was going to scare me, I was like, nope.
Sure. I understand that.
So I'm watching all these 80s movies now. I'm like, this is amazing. Why was I missing this? You know? So.
This is definitely one of my favorite eras. I do like to be scared, but I also like to have like a zany, fun time, and that's when I always go to these movies.
Yeah.
I'm curious, Terry, about what you have to say about like how this is kind of an answer to the 50s, 50s one. Yeah, I thought that was an interesting insight that I hadn't thought of at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the 50s, and this really was brought home rewatching both of them kind of back to back this weekend. The 50s edition has a very golly gee feel to it, where it's like the Steve McQueen, he gets in trouble with the law for driving backwards down a street. Like that's the extent of the shenanigans that gets pulled in this town. And it's very much the police are there to protect you. They don't necessarily believe them in the beginning, because who's going to believe it's the same situation as here? Who's going to believe there's this blob of something that is dissolving people, and it doesn't leave anything behind? So obviously there's no like evidence, right? So there's that initial pull where the police don't believe him, but by the end of the film, the police are there shooting the thing. They're trying to save the people that are trapped in the diner that the blob is covered over. And they call the military, and the military comes in, and ultimately, between the entire town coming together as one to save the day, they freeze the monster, and the military drop it into the Arctic, where it will stay until the Arctic ever melts. Like, oh, hello.
2020, oh no.
Yeah, but like everyone is working together. The police are there to help you. The military is there to save your butt at the very end. It's very, very 1950s. Golly gee, we're going to be okay. Trust the people that are running things to get things done. And so this film, while it does have a lot of camp, and it definitely takes some of the sequences from that movie and kind of reinvents them. There's a scene in the theater in both movies. For instance, there's this sort of the old man that gets blobbed in the beginning, but it kind of subverts those expectations by, this is not a meteor, this is a satellite that our government put up in the space to do biological warfare for. It's being covered up by scientists, being covered up by the government, and they have decided that they're going to quarantine this town because it's like a biological weapon. It's a virus, in other words. We're going to quarantine this town. Everyone's expendable. It sort of kind of tackles that same vibe as like Alien, where it's like, we must have this organism, right? Mm-hmm. And so it takes that sort of nihilism and creates this thing where the people that are there to protect us can't. The sheriff gets eaten. The deputy gets split in half. It's actually the people themselves that end up rising up against this thing and rising up against authority to basically say, no, we're going to protect ourselves and save the day. So it feels like it is taking the kind of themes that were introduced in that original one and saying, no, this is not that same kind of 1950s golly gee that you're probably expecting.
Mm-hmm.
Which I feel like at the 80s, that was really trying to, at least where I grew up, was being like rammed down my throat. Like, trust the government. It's good. The 50s were the magical time. And I mean, we're still hearing that now, you know? So I think, I really loved that element of the movie, you know?
This is a movie, too, that comes out, like, right at the height of the Iran-Contra scandal as well. Like, the hearings are going on. And there is, like, we talked about Paranoia when we did The Burbs and we did Fright Night. But this is a movie that also fits very well. And there's a thread of, like, government paranoia that runs throughout movies in the 80s, whether it's even child's fare like E.T. You see that. You see that in movies like War Games, where we can't be trusted. But this is a movie where there's a vast government conspiracy that's being withheld, and you see like the scientists are there under the government's direction, and you see they have no qualms. Like, they're not there to protect the citizens. They actually have no problem saying that the citizens are going to be expendable, and this is just like a quick little excerpt from the executive summaries, finding and conclusions of the Iran-Contra hearings, where the common ingredients of the Iran and Contra policies were secrecy, deception, and disdain for the law. A small group of senior officials believed they alone knew what was right. They viewed the knowledge of their actions by others in the government as a threat to their objectives. So you have like this movie that comes out right in the height of the federal government being accused of like covering things up, and that the people don't have a right to know. And I think that's a thread you see in a lot of movies of the 80s, where on one hand you're saying trust the people, trust the helpers, or to the other hand you're saying like don't trust people in charge.
Yeah, and I was going to say, like, again, having watched this in the early 2000s and then watching it now, it hit a little different given COVID and everything, you know, just those themes of, and I think if you were to make the Blob again, if you made it on a 30-year cycle, what would happen would be this Blob comes out of nowhere. No one can figure out where or why. We try to get help from the government, and then they say there's no Blob. And then all the people in the town tear each other apart. Yep. And then they're.
All right, so I'll stop that there. Well, you get the point that I'm trying to get across, is that they're analysing a movie from 1988 that's a remake of a movie from the 1950s, and then overlaying the current situation, which I thought was interesting, because they're using the movie as a way to psychoanalyze the current situation as well as psychoanalyze the movie. So it's an interesting podcast. I don't necessarily like the format. It's a bit too long for me, but I've listened to a couple of them all the way through, and there are some interesting points in there, but they do tend to ramble on a little bit, so I thought short clips are enough. If I can pull any more short clips out of their analysis of the Blob, then I will, and if I listen to any more of them, then I'll pull out some clips just because I find it interesting, the way they're analysing things. Because you can either go directly to the current situation, or you can use the metaphor of a movie. And in this case, it's the metaphor of a movie that's a remake of a movie. So it's one or two steps removed from the current situation, but they are still tying things together through a theme of paranoia, basically, which I thought was interesting. Anyway, that's it for now. I just wanted to give you that. And I'll see you a bit later on.